Hi guys, and welcome to my desert basin tutorial. So here are all my models that I'm doing the bases for. This is the splintered fang. I've got them assembled first so that I can see where best to place all the different elements on the bases. I'm starting off with a base coat of rhinox hide. I'm just quickly slapping this on, not really worried too much about getting a good coverage. I just want to make sure that every base has paint on it. This will help the elements that I put on next stick to the bases better. So now I've got that rhinox hide on, I'm going to be using Geek Gaming's Sand and Stone base ready range, I believe it's called. And there you can see I'm just checking the placement of the model before deciding where to put these stones and that on the bases. So I'm using super glue here just for quick, easy placement of the rocks and stones. I could have used PVA, or I could have used the fast drying base glue from Geek Gaming, but I just wanted these done quickly. So there you can see I'm placing the model, having a good look at it, making sure that the rock isn't detracting from the model or taking over the base too much. And I did this with each and every model in this 10-man squad, well 9-man and 1 snake squad or unit. So here I am, just scattering a few small stones on some of the slightly smaller bases, again checking placement. Now it's time for some Grelin earth and some beach sand from AK Interactive. I'm going to be using both of these in conjunction with each other, but first off I'm going to use the Grelin earth. The reason why I'm doing this is because I like the way they interact with each other when you apply them both at the same time. I'm putting the Grelin earth on first, but I'll be putting the AK Interactive on afterwards while the Grelin earth is still wet, and then blending them in together to create a decent transition. Now colour wise they're very different, but this will get fixed with the latest step. So here I am just putting the Grelin earth on nice and thin. I'm not putting it on too thick because I don't want big large cracks, I just want small ones. The thicker you put a Grelin earth on the bases, the bigger the cracks appear and the more cracks there will be. So I was very careful at this stage just not to get it all over the rocks and stones that I placed, and just putting it on in random places. It didn't really matter where. I didn't need to really check where the models stand for this stage. The most important bit was making sure that I wasn't placing stones or rocks that would make touching the models afterwards more difficult. I always do my bases separately from the models. I just find it better for me personally. I just find it easier to get to all the parts of the base without ruining an awesome paint job on a model, and also it just means you can see the base better and get a better understanding of how it looks. So now we've got the Grelin earth on all these bases, now I'm going to move on to the AK Interactive beach sand. I'm just putting a blob of Grelin earth on that last one that I'd forgotten about. But now we're on to the beach sand. Now this is a very pale colour, as you can see. It looks extremely different from the Grelin earth, but they do actually transition well into each other. They are mixable, and I will fix the colour difference later on, which you'll see what I do to fix that. But what this will do is give quite a sandy appearance, but growing out into dried, parched ground, because I really wanted this to look realistic and have different elements to it that you notice when you look closer at the models. So again, I'm just placing it nice and thin, being careful not to get it on the rocks or the stones. Just placing it around the base. You can see that quite a harsh line there between the two different textures, but I will be going back in a second and making this a little bit better. So there you can see I'm going around where the Grelin earth and the beach sand is, and I'm just stippling some of the Grelin earth out a bit and stippling some of the edges just to make that transition look a little bit more believable. Doing this bit at this stage just helps it a little bit better when we do the later stages, that fixes the colour difference. If I hadn't have done this, there might not have been a colour difference, but you would have definitely seen one patch being quite obvious a grelin earth and the rest looking quite obvious beach sand, and it wouldn't have looked quite right. So now I'm using Green Stuff Wild earth pigments. These are weathering pigments. I haven't actually used them for weathering, but I had this idea. I've watched James Wapple do this on some Dothraki Screamers from A Song of Ice and Fire, and I thought I would give this a go. So I'm just applying it nice and thin, smoothing it over the whole base. Now you can use any colours for this. I used the light ochre, the light sand, and I think I used the medium sand coloured in the pack. It's a 6-pack of different shades of desert and earthy kind of tones. Works really well, and it works off a wet palette as well, so you can thin it down as much as you like to create some different effects. And I do want to experiment more with this further. I didn't water these down any more than what they came out of the bottles, but they are already quite watery. But they dry to a powdery finish, which I think really adds to the realism of sandy, deserty textures. So these would be really good for adding weathering to tanks, or things like if you were doing an army of desert rats for your bolt action or things like that, or just applying to the feet or boots of your models that are in a desert wasteland. But I wanted to actually incorporate it onto the bases themselves, and also just to hide them transitions. As you can see, it's quite a harsh line between those two textures, but adding these paints gradually dulls that transition line out. That paint looks very opaque as I'm putting it on, but as it dries it does go very transparent, so sometimes you might want to add more. This is very easy process, anyone can do it. I'm just so happy with these, I thought I'd make it into a video and share it. So here I am using that darker earth colour, that's like a dark reddish tone, and I'm just blending it in. I'm kind of doing like a glaze, I guess, like a feathered glaze over them transition lines, just trying to help those transitions a little bit more. As you can see, as it dried, that they were more obvious again. So I had to go back really to fix that, because it would have just looked awful if I'd have left it. It would have looked like I'd tried to do some weird camo pattern all over the bases or something like that. I wanted this bases to look like sand has blown about and there's dirt and gravel and all kinds of things going on. If you look at real sand, like out in real deserts, there's many different colours and elements to them. So now for the final element, I'm adding some grass tufts. I'm going for a greeny, brownish, kind of sick, dead colour grass tuft to them, and I'm placing these where I think they'll look good with each particular model, but I'm also doing it where some of the harsh transition lines between the Agrellan Earth and the AK Interactive Sand just weren't being hidden very well. And as you can see there, I was piercing a hole in the bottle, because these bottles do not have holes in them when you first get them. So if you do buy these and you're shaking them like mad and trying to squeeze paint out, be very careful, because the end will shoot off unless you've put that hole in the end first. So there I'm just placing the model, making sure it looks okay, and then deciding where to put the grass tuft. I did actually have to go back and trim a couple of the grass tufts, because even though I cut them down before putting them on the bases, a couple of them were still too big and were taking over the models a bit. So now I'm going back in and painting them stones. A lot of the base ready range from Geek Gaming is base ready, you don't need to add any paint or washes or anything, but the sand and stone and the city rubble ones from Geek Gaming specifically do really need a wash, or at least a dry brush or something to bring out the more depth to them. They're just single colours, they're just like getting any box of gravel or sand that you'd stick on your bases. They really do help when they get a dry brush and a wash or something to those effects on them. So I'm just going over all the bases quite carefully, not really a dry brush, more like a wet over brush, just catching all the sharp edges and elements with the ash grey. Now I'm going in again with the matte white, which is anything but matte white, but that doesn't really matter. After dry brushing with the ash grey, I'd already decided that I was going to go 2 or 3 steps further with these stones and rocks just to bring out the elements even further. So I'm quickly bashing on this matte white. And this will look really harsh, which is why I'm going to then add a wash after this stage. It looked okay as it was wet, but as it dried, the white kind of glossed out a little bit and it looked quite harsh, but it also just made the rocks look very lifeless and fake. But here I am just working through them, being careful not to get the white over the rest of the base. As you can see, I'm just using a flat dry brush kind of brush, but I'm being quite careful. Now for the magic, Basilicanum Grey. I love this contrast paint. Some of the contrast paints aren't that great, but Basilicanum Grey is brilliant. I absolutely love it. So here I am just placing it on the rock, and I'm being quite careful with it. I'm not just slapping it on. I don't want to get it all over the rest of the base. I should have painted these first before I added the weathering pigments onto the sandy areas, but I didn't know how these would turn out, so this is the first time I'd ever done it. It really would have helped if I'd have painted these first, because then I could have added the weathering powders afterwards and I could have got some of that onto the rocks and stones, which would have tied them more into the bases. But I can always go back and just add a thinned out weathering pigments onto the rocks and the stones, just to bring them to life a little bit more, and also even into the grass tufts, because sand gets everywhere when you have wind storms at night and the crazy weather that you get, the cold and the extreme winds and tornadoes and all sorts that you get in real desert wastelands. And there I was just applying a final dry brush of ash grey, and as you can see there, it's brought out the rocks a lot better. You can see them now. Before, they kind of disappeared into the background, and I'm really happy with them, guys. I don't know what you think, but tell me. Write your comments below, just let me know what you think of this basing tutorial. And there we have it. There's the final picture of what they look like. I'm really happy with these guys, and I'll hopefully be doing more basing tutorials in the future, and maybe even some model tutorials. Thanks a lot.